The US has accused Russia of meddling in this year's presidential election. So, what tactics has Russia been using, and are they having any impact on voters? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, according to US government officials, the Kremlin has been using state-run channels such as Russia Today and front organisations to spread fake news across social media platforms. Earlier this month, Merrick Garland, US Attorney General, warned that the Department of Justice has zero tolerance towards Russian attempts to influence the upcoming election.
The Justice Department's message is clear. We have no tolerance for attempts by authoritarian regimes to exploit our democratic system of government. We will be relentlessly aggressive in countering and disrupting attempts by Russia and Iran, as well as China or any other foreign malign actor to interfere in our elections and undermine our democracy.
Well, this isn't the first time the US has accused Russia of meddling in its elections. So what makes the US vulnerable to Russian disinformation, and can it be stopped? Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is the deputy foreign editor of Komsomolskaya Pravda. It's a daily Russian tabloid newspaper. From Sheffield in the UK is Colin Alexander. He's a senior lecturer in political communications. That's at Nottingham Trent University. And here with me in the studio is Kelsey Farish. She is a media and entertainment lawyer and a leading analyst on generative AI. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Kelsey, I'll come to you first. I think it was Mark Twain who said that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And this was a century and a half before the development of social media and the internet. And he was right.
He was absolutely right. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize really is that lying and disinformation and propaganda, these aren't new concepts. What's new is the speed with which they can spread and the veracity with which people take hold of them. So,
and I mean, people are seeing stuff. A lot of the time, you know, people won't be fact-checking. They're not journalists that are putting this out there. This is, you know, made up, a lot of it. Do you think people believe it?
I think that people do believe it. And I will be the first to admit that even I myself, as an expert in this domain, I have retweeted things that later turned out to be deepfakes. Why? Because they aligned with my views. They seemed real, they seemed plausible, and it was coming from a source that I thought that I could trust. Today, we as individuals get much of our information, our beliefs are shaped by those around us. We don't always look to, you know, one or two singular news agencies for information. We look at our friends, we look at our colleagues, and when people who are purporting to be just like us say things, we're more inclined to believe them.
Dmitry, do you accept that Russia is doing this, that there is a Russian state-organised misinformation campaign to do with this US election?
No, I don't think so, because we have heard it so many times before. Remember, it all started back in 2016 and even earlier, when Hillary Clinton started saying that somehow Russia was helping Donald Trump. And then we had several New York Times reporters getting Pulitzer Prizes for exposing what they called collusion between Trump and Trump campaign and Russia. And we remember there was a special investigator, you know, this counsel Mueller, who basically prepared a report in April 2019, which specifically said that there was no collusion between Trump's campaign and Russia. But these people from the New York Times, of course, kept their prizes. They didn't return them. They didn't turn them back. Why? Because it fitted their ideology. You know, the New York Times represents a certain ideology. You can call it liberal, you can call it neoliberal, you can call it globalist, whatever. But obviously, we know their agenda. And unfortunately, this narrative about Russian involvement in U.S. election is part of that agenda. It's part of that narrative. Instead, we're fed this conspiracy theory about Russia electing Trump in 2016, and then Russia trying to get Trump elected in 2020. Of course, Russia has its preferences like any country, but of course, the United States pays a lot more money to get their people somehow in power in Russia than vice versa.
Colin, how much of a threat do you think Russian misinformation is then in this US election campaign?
I think you have to see it in amongst the melee of all the other sources of information which swirl around. And so in direct answer to your question, I say that it does have a role. However, there's a danger of overstating that role. Perhaps the most interesting thing is that when it comes to a democratic election in any country in the world, there are external influences that try to, as the previous speaker was just saying, try to get their person as prominent as possible. So, and I should also say that the United States has been the main instigator of this around the world, sometimes violently so, in order to ensure that US interests are met. So there's nothing really new about what's happening here. Perhaps the concern is, first of all, that Russia is seen as an enemy force, and also that perhaps their mischief making may well be attempting to further polarize. I don't think it's responsible for polarizing, but further polarizing what is already a divided society.
Kelsey, I notice quite a few news websites that have sprung up with the names of old American newspapers that don't even exist anymore. So people clicking on these links would see names like Houston and Chicago and be kind of drawn in thinking this was real journalism. And it turns out a lot of them are basically being controlled by Russia. How worried are you that American citizens are logging into this stuff and thinking that they are reading American journalism?
Well, there are three things really that I would say to that. And the first is, you've talked about kind of, using old newspaper names and logos. And that's actually why the US government has gone after these individuals on the basis of trademark infringement. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that Americans, perhaps more so than Europeans, are really focused more so on stories that are closer to home. They may, let's say they're in Texas, they may not care so much about what's going on in Maine or elsewhere in the country. And so they want to be drawn to the stories that their local news organizations are covering. And the third piece of that is, again, to what I said earlier, when we see things that are from our local community, we're more likely to believe them, right? And so in terms of how worried should we be, I think we have to remember that this isn't necessarily about Russian disinformation or actions by state actors. It really speaks to media regulation on the whole and lack of media literacy from our citizenship.
And just tell me, American voters, is an American voter likely to change their opinion off the back of a news story that they've read somewhere? I mean, everything seems to be so visceral and divided right now in the United States.
That's right. And I think back to what Colin was saying, disinformation in whatever form it takes, whether it's from a state actor or a foreign actor or otherwise, it's exacerbating pre-existing problems. And a lot of those in the United States, where I'm originally from, tend to be social. They tend to be emotive. And I would say that most Americans vote on the basis of their cultural surroundings and their cultural beliefs and social issues. And by and large, I think that people pretty much have their opinions made up one way or another. And that's why things like debates about big topics where you can, get some negative comments in or some, gotcha zingers in there, those tend to be more talked about than, say, a sophisticated policy paper. Now, what does this have to do with social media disinformation? Well, it's because things like comments on Instagram or clips from a debate, that's really shareable. That's interesting and engaging to watch. You're not going to do some sort of manipulated policy paper that's pages and pages long, because people aren't going to read that, are they?
Dmitry, we did have a response from Russia today, or RT, about the allegations, and it's quite tongue-in-cheek. They say there are three things that are certain in life now: death, taxes, and RT interference in US elections. So, a little bit of a cheeky response there from RT, but tell me, looking ahead, do you think these allegations will keep resurfacing every time there's an election in the US?
Yes, they will keep resurfacing. Just let me remind you that it's the third election in a row which the mainstream media in the United States claims to have been influenced or to be influenced by the Russian media, and especially by RT. And, I'm puzzled. I remember the Soviet times when Mr. Brezhnev accused, Radio Liberty of trying to undermine the Soviet Union. But it was mentioned, once in a month, once in 6 months sometimes. And the problem with the attitude to RT in the United States and in the European Union is that people in the United States and in the European Union, especially in the United States, they have been hearing for several years, like every day there were news, and sometimes invented news, about Russian interference in the elections. Let me remind you that until April 2019, until Mr. Mueller's report, there were, people said with absolute certainty that there was collusion between Trump and Russia, Trump's campaign and Russia. They sent teams to Prague, journalist teams, which were investigating something that never happened. The mainstream media itself in the United States acknowledged that some of the news stories that they followed, some of the news items were just fake. And no one apologized for that, unfortunately. What troubles me is the scope of this anti-Russia campaign in the United States. Now we're not living in the best times in that sense in Russia. A lot of media, a lot of journalists are complaining about people who left Russia and who do what they call anti-Russian propaganda from abroad. But again, we hear it once in 2 days, once in 3 days. It's not every day. And there are no media outlets in the West that the Russian government would declare like our personal enemies, special centers that spread disinformation. And RT has been demonized by the Western politicians. It keeps being mentioned in very negative contexts. And I think it's just not wise, because I remember from our Soviet experience that there is a forbidden fruit effect. In the end of the 80s, the majority of Soviet people believed that Radio Liberty was telling them absolute truth, 100% truth, precisely because for so many years, Radio Liberty was demonized, Radio Free Europe, I mean. In the same way, unfortunately, I'm afraid the Western leaders may get this backlash, They say so many negative things about RT that a lot of people would try to tune in, despite all the prohibitions and despite all the technical difficulties, because the obvious question that springs up in your mind, if the government is so much against this media outlet, probably it is telling us some very important truth.
Let's bring Colin back in. Colin, there's one common theme to a lot of this fake news and misinformation, and it's a very anti-Ukraine slant. I noticed one story that was viewed by 12 million people on a certain website, and it got retweeted by influencers, and it claimed that the First Lady of Ukraine had visited Paris and bought a Bugatti sports car for $4.5 million US with money that was meant to go to the war effort in Ukraine. Zero facts. This did not happen. Completely fake news. Should we be worried that 12 million people have read this and it's completely false?
Well, there's two parts to that. The first thing is, just because 12.5 million people read it doesn't mean that 12.5 million people believed it. I mean, Kelsey makes a good point. There's several good points here about media literacy. And we do have a crisis in media literacy from a psychological perspective, because we overestimate the extent to which humans are truth-loving beings, and most of the time we use media to gratify the worldview that we already have. So in terms of the direct question about this story or any other story, there's a danger of what's called the hypodermic needle effect, where the assumption is that just because a message is being communicated, the message is received by the individual reading it or watching something. People have a range of reasons for why they engage with media. So there's an element of presumption in that. I think the other point I wanted to make was just was around the selectivity of the concern about Russia, in that Russia is the kind of flavor of the day in terms of the threat that it is perceived to pose. But if you go back to, for example, the 1980s, where the Reagan administration in the US was making all sorts of claims about the ability of tiny little Nicaragua to influence the minds of the American public with their socialist ideology. And ultimately, so there's an element of selectivity here. And the first point about the New York Times that was being made as well there, saying, well, all media, in Russian media, British media, whatever you want, has an element of nationalism to it. They understand where their bread is buttered, so to speak, in terms of sources, in terms of advertising. So they tend to have a slant towards the national interest of their home country. So I think on that sense, there is no sort of impartiality here within the mainstream media, and there certainly is no impartiality in the online sphere either.
Kelsey, a lot of the disinformation, as I said to Colin, is aimed at the Ukraine war. And basically the gist of it seems to be that telling the American public that the tax dollars heading to Ukraine are being misused or there's corruption there. This is completely false. Should we be worried that that is the narrative that is being trying to be spun to the American public, that, you know, Ukraine war, forget about it?
You know, all of this brings to mind being a teenager in the United States during the aftermath of 9/11, when Don Rumsfeld stood in front of the American people and said that Al Jazeera was a terrorist organization. And this reflects really what Dmitry has said and what Colin has said too, that, you know, we, as Americans, I'm afraid, do have a tendency sometimes to point to news organizations from abroad and say, I don't agree with what they're saying, therefore it's bad, therefore it's a terrorist organization or what have you. So putting that to one side, however, should we be worried that what we perceive to be as truth is being manipulated? Well, yes, but saying things that are wrong or just factually inaccurate, that's not against the law per se. What's against the law, I suppose, is doing these things in a really deceitful, manipulative way and purporting to speak with authority when you don't have any. It's not a problem to say, I disagree with the war in Ukraine. It is a problem to say, you know, these are lies around it and they are true. So again, to answer your question, should we be worried? Yes, but I think it's a much broader question. It's about our position in the world, whether that's the United States vis-a-vis Europe or vis-a-vis Russia and beyond. And I also think that it's a social one. It's no secret that the United States and Russia have had a very complicated relationship over the last century. And this is just becoming more exacerbated now.
You mentioned something earlier on that I was quite fascinated by, where you said people retweet according to their prejudice or their interests. I mean, influencers have a big responsibility here, don't they?
That's exactly right. And the lure of influencers is that we can look at them and say, they look like me, they speak like me, I can aspire to be like them. That's why we follow them. That's why they're engaging, is because they're human and they're not some big corporation. They're a real person just like us. And so this, again, is an element of the alleged Russian disinformation campaign, is the use of individuals who are either generated by AI or perhaps are unwilling influencers. And that is a tactic. You use influencers to get your message across. And people are more likely to believe them because they look at a person and say, she sounds like me, she looks like me, she's a 30-something-year-old that I can relate to, not some, if you'll forgive me, man in a suit in front of a,
Thanks,
in a studio, right? But this is, and Colin and Dmitry both know this. When we speak to audiences and in a relatable way, rather than an authoritative way, our stories are more persuasive and they're more compelling. And I think that the question about influencers and politics is a really complicated one.
Dmitry, can we assume that Russia would prefer to see Donald Trump back in the White House rather than Kamala Harris win the election?
I think Russians have different views on that. And of course, there is a lot of confusion about the Russian position. What did President Putin mean when he said that we would, Harris would be better for Russia than Trump? I think certainly Putin is expecting, just like we Russians, we are expecting the worst right now because we live in a very troubled time. Unfortunately, the United States and the European Union are not in the best of shapes. So we are used to expecting the worst. But I would like to join the conversation. I think Colin is right when he says that there is a slant for national interest in every media. But there is also a certain minority in every country which has a sort of an inferiority complex, which accuses its own country of being wrong and of always saying lies. In Russia, in the end of 80s, in the early 90s, we had a huge inferiority complex, which basically brought the Soviet Union down. It was the main factor, I think. And in the West right now, there is a smaller part of society, but still a very significant one, which just doesn't believe the mainstream media. And these people tune in to RT, Al Jazeera, it doesn't matter what, precisely because they don't expect their own media to tell them the truth. And talking about fakes, certainly Russia was not the one to invent it. Let me remind you that the United States made fake videos of Fidel Castro, I think back in the 70s or even in the 60s, portraying him as consuming luxury food in the company of fast women. But that is classics, that's long ago. There were, of course, a lot of Western fakes about President Putin, such as presenting him as sick, almost dying, or insane. And I think the biggest fake of our times was, of course, the campaign in the Western media before the American invasion of Iraq, certainly American-British invasion of Iraq in 2003, when if you didn't believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, you were declared a flat earther.
Let's bring Colin in on that. Dmitry, thanks. Let's bring Colin in. I just want to hear what Colin has to say about that people have so little faith in mainstream media that they will believe anything they see elsewhere.
I thought you'd never ask. I've been itching to talk about this. First of all, what Kelsey said about the aftermath of 9/11, there's a juxtaposition here in that many, and this is not just US viewers, but people around the world, in the Western world, were really dissatisfied with the quality of mainstream media's reporting of 9/11 itself and then the aftermath in terms of the invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and then Iraq in 2003. And this led to them turning to alternative sources or the available alternative sources at the time. And we must then take a step back and say, well, actually, the purpose of all governance is around the sustaining or the growth of power. And therefore, what the complaint is here is that ultimately that they are potentially losing control of the media narrative, of the global media narrative, of the global battle for hearts and minds. And therefore, they try to dismiss or dissuade us from searching for alternative sources that are unconducive to their interests. At the same time, though, in 2002, the New York Times published an editorial stating very clearly that it did not do enough analysis and it did not hold the powerful of the United States to account, and they were too ready to believe the narrative around things like weapons of mass destruction, etc. And I think on a final part here is just that we know that governments lie, not all the time, but sometimes they lie. Equally, sometimes the mainstream news media lies. And we have to bear that in mind, that, or I should say, they tell such a selected truth as to skew what the reality of a situation is. So we do have to bear in mind, these are not people who are simply idiots for searching out alternative sources. An alternative source is done usually in terms of academic media research. People look for alternative sources out of a dissatisfaction with the information that's being provided by their regular sources.
Colin, thank you. Dmitry and Kelsey as well. Fascinating discussion. Remember, you can see more debate and discussion on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.